The storage unit smelled like mothballs and 40 years of dust, and I was holding a shoebox that wasn't supposed to exist. My name is Naomi. I'm 39, an archivist at the Millbrook Historical Society in Millbrook Hollow, Vermont, which is either a very funny coincidence or the least surprising job in the world for a woman who apparently needed, her whole life, to learn how to read a paper trail before she could read her own. It was late October, 2 years to the week since my mother Elaine died, and I was finally doing the thing grief counselors tell you to do and everyone puts off anyway, clearing out the last storage unit, the one with the boxes even my mother hadn't opened in a decade. My daughter Ruby, 15 and allergic to sentimentality the way only teenagers can be, had come along to help and was mostly scrolling her phone on an overturned milk crate. The shoebox was at the bottom of a box labeled winter coats in my mother's handwriting, wrapped in a wool scarf, taped shut with tape gone brittle and yellow. Inside, a single manila folder, and inside that, a birth certificate. Mine. Or a version of mine I'd never seen. The name on it wasn't Naomi Calloway. It was Naomi Ann, no last name filled in, the space left blank in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. The mother's name field said Whitmore. Not Elaine. A date of birth that matched mine. And in the corner, in handwriting I recognized instantly because I'd been looking at it on birthday cards my entire life, my Aunt Carol's handwriting, a single margin note, handled. Records sealed per agreement, June 14th. Mom? Ruby said, noticing my face. You okay? I want to be honest about what I felt in that storage unit, because it wasn't shock, not exactly. It was something stranger, a kind of recognition, like a word you've been trying to remember finally surfacing, except the word was my own life. I'm fine, I said, which was the first lie of many that month, and folded the birth certificate back into the scarf like it might disintegrate if I held it too long in the open air. I should tell you who I was before that afternoon, because the woman who found that folder and the woman who'd spent 39 years not finding it were, in a lot of ways, the same careful, avoidant person. I grew up in Millbrook Hollow, the daughter of Walter and Elaine Calloway, my father a quiet man who ran the hardware store on Main until he died when I was 24, my mother a schoolteacher, warm and precise and occasionally, I'd always thought, a little sad in a way I never asked her about. We weren't rich, not by the standards of the Calloways who mattered. That branch of the family belonged to my father's older sister, my Aunt Carol, who had spent 40 years turning our great-grandfather's mill fortune into the Calloway Family Trust, a foundation that funded half the town's civic life and gave Carol, by extension, something close to local royalty status. I'd always known there was money in the family and none of it was really ours. I'd always known Carol ran things, decided which cousins got trust distributions for college, which got quietly excluded, who sat where at Thanksgiving. What I hadn't known, until that October afternoon in a storage unit that smelled like mothballs, was that the space between our branch and the money might have had my own name written across it in Carol's handwriting 39 years ago. It looked like love, growing up in that house. My father read to me every night until I was 10. My mother kept every drawing I ever made in a drawer she called the museum. If you'd asked me, any day before that October, whether I was loved completely and without complication in that family, I would have said yes, and meant it, and mostly still mean it now. That's the part one keep coming back to. Whatever this turned out to be, it wasn't an absence of love. It was something folded inside the love, hidden the way you hide something you're afraid will end it. Ruby drove home with me that evening. She's had her permits 6 months and treats every drive like a personal referendum on her competence, and I sat in the passenger seat with the folder in my bag, saying nothing, watching Millbrook Hollow's 1 Main Street slide past in October light, and I thought, I'll look at this properly tomorrow, when I'm not so tired. I didn't look at it again for 11 days. I told myself I was busy. I wasn't. I was afraid, the particular fear of a woman who has built a stable, ordinary, hard-won life and suspects that opening one folder might take a crowbar to the foundation of it. I didn't know it yet, but that folder wasn't the strangest thing I'd find that month. It was only the door. 11 days later, my best friend Denise came over with a bottle of wine, the way she'd done every few weeks since her divorce, and I almost told her right then. Denise and I had known each other since 2nd grade. She worked 2 desks down from me at the Historical Society, cataloging county records that predated digitization, and if anyone in Millbrook Hollow had spent her career closer to the raw paper truth of this town than I had, it was her. "You've been weird for like 2 weeks," she said, pouring generously. "I found something of my mom's. In storage. I haven't really looked at it yet." Something moved across Denise's face, quick, there and gone, the kind of flicker I'd have missed if I hadn't spent 20 years learning to read microexpressions in faded county ledgers for a living. "What kind of something?" "A birth certificate." Not the one I have. A different one. With Carol's handwriting on it." Denise set her glass down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started, faintly, to shake. "I should get going," she said. "Early morning." It was 7:30. She'd never left early in 15 years of Tuesday wine nights. I didn't push her at the door. I let her go, the way I let most things go, telling myself I was respecting her space, when really I think some deep, self-protective part of me understood that if I pushed, I'd get an answer, and I wasn't ready for the answer yet. I didn't sleep much that night. If I'd asked Denise the direct question right then, at my own front door, instead of 3 weeks later, I think everything that came after would have unfolded differently. Not the truth itself. The truth was already fixed, already 39 years old. But the cost of getting to it might have been smaller. The following Sunday was the Callaway Trust's annual Harvest Gala, an event I'd attended every year of my life, first as a child in an itchy dress, now as an adult who mostly stood near the cheese table and left by 9. Carol presided over it the way she presided over everything, composed, gracious, magnetic in the specific way of people who have never once doubted their right to a room. She found me by the dessert table. "You look tired, Naomi," she said, which from Carol was practically a term of endearment. "Everything all right at the house? Ruby doing well?" "We're fine. I was actually going through some of Mom's old storage boxes recently." Something crossed Carol's face, so brief I might have imagined it, except I didn't, the same flicker I'd seen on Denise 11 days earlier, like the whole family had been rehearsing the same small flinch for decades and I was only now learning to recognize the choreography. "Found anything interesting?" Carol asked, and her voice had exactly the same too quick, too light quality my mother's had used, my whole childhood, whenever a subject was about to be closed before it opened. "A few things," I said. I don't know why I didn't say it plainly, right there, folder practically burning a hole in my bag at home. Maybe because some part of me already understood that whatever this was, it was bigger than a party could hold. Maybe because 20 years of watching Carol Whitmore run a room had taught me she was never caught off guard in public, and some instinct told me that whatever answer I got standing near a dessert table would be a managed one, not a true one. "You should come by the house sometime this week," Carol said. "We haven't had a proper visit in ages." I said I would. I didn't think, in that moment, that a proper visit might mean something closer to damage control than affection. I would understand that soon enough. If you've ever found a document that didn't match the life you thought you were living, stay with me. Because what I found in the next 3 weeks would take the ground out from under a story I'd been standing on for 39 years. For a while after the gala, my life kept its ordinary shape on the surface. I went to work, cataloged deeds and probate records for people 300 years dead, drove Ruby to soccer practice, made dinner most nights I had the energy for it. Underneath, though, something had shifted, the way a house shifts on its foundation, imperceptibly, until a door won't close right and you can't remember exactly when that started. I finally opened the folder properly on a Wednesday night after Ruby went to bed. Beyond the birth certificate, there was a single sheet of onionskin paper, a photocopy of something older, headed with a name I didn't recognize, Havenwood Home for Unwed Mothers, 1986. A case number. No names beyond initials. And a line, near the bottom, that I read 4 times before it made sense, placement arranged privately per family request. No agency involvement per WC. WC. Not Walter Callaway, my father's initials were the same, which had confused me at first, until I did the math and understood the timeline made him 26 that year, unmarried, 3 years before he met my mother. It wasn't my father's handling. It couldn't have been. Which left, in that family, exactly one person whose initials also fit and whose handwriting I'd already found once already. Carol Whitmore, 29 in 1986, already, even then, the one who handled things. I started noticing details I'd spent a lifetime not noticing. The way my mother had never once told me a single specific story about the day I was born, not the hospital, not the weather, not what my father said when he saw me, where every other mother I knew had these stories memorized like scripture. The way there was no baby photo of me before approximately 4 months old, a gap I'd always assumed was just the 80s, just bad record keeping, never once a suspicious absence. I called my mother's old friend Ruth, who'd known Elaine since college, mostly to ask an innocent question about a different matter, and near the end of the call, feeling reckless, I asked, "Did my mom ever talk to you about the year before I was born?" Like, 1986. The pause on the line went on a beat too long. "You should ask your Aunt Carol about that," Ruth said, carefully, and changed the subject to her grandkids, and I sat there afterward with the phone still in my hand, understanding that I had just asked a question 3 separate people had now deflected with the exact same sentence, worded almost identically, like a line the whole family had been handed at some point and told to keep close. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever asked a question and watched everyone in the room find somewhere else to look, you already know that specific, cold loneliness. It isn't dramatic. It's quiet, and it sits in your chest for days. I did what I do for a living. I started pulling records, the actual proper way, using every resource my job had ever taught me. The Havenwood Home for Unwed Mothers had closed in 1994. Its records, I learned from an old county cross-reference, had been transferred to the State Archive in Montpelier and were sealed under Vermont's closed adoption statutes, accessible, technically, only to the adopted person themselves, with a formal petition, a process that could take months. I filed the petition anyway, on a Thursday during my lunch break, hands not quite steady on the keyboard. Then I did something smaller, and in hindsight, more consequential. I asked Denise, directly, at her desk, no wine to soften it this time. "You've worked in county records for 20 years. Did you ever process anything connected to a private adoption placement, 1986, arranged by someone in the Calloway family?" Denise went very still, the exact stillness I'd seen twice already, and this time she didn't leave the room. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face broke slightly, like she'd been holding a weight and had just been told she could finally, possibly, put part of it down. "Not here," she said. "Not at work. Come by tonight." I didn't think about anything else for the rest of that day. Every deed, every probate record I catalogued that afternoon blurred past unread while I ran the same sentence through my head on a loop, waiting for evening the way you wait for a verdict. That evening, in Denise's kitchen, she told me, in pieces, stopping twice to steady her voice, that in 1986 she'd been a 19-year-old records clerk, brand new, terrified of losing a job she needed badly, when Carol Whitmore had come to her personally with a private placement to process, quietly, off the standard channel, a family matter, and had made it clear, in the particular way powerful people make things clear without ever quite threatening anyone, that Denise's continued employment and the Whitmore family's goodwill toward the records office, which funded half its budget through the trust, depended on discretion. "I sealed a file I shouldn't have sealed the normal way," Denise said. "I've carried that for 39 years, Naomi. I didn't know until years later whose baby it actually was. And once I did know, I didn't know how to tell you without telling you everything, and I was scared of what everything actually was, because I never fully understood it myself. I just knew Carol wanted it buried, and I helped bury it, because I was 19 and needed the job." "Whose baby," I said, very quietly, "was it?" Denise looked at me with something like grief already forming behind her eyes. "I only ever knew initials, Naomi. RW. I always assumed it stood for someone outside the family. I didn't put it together, I didn't let myself put it together, until you asked me at my desk today. RW and the birth certificate in my kitchen drawer, in Carol's own handwriting, R. Whitmore. Carol had a younger sister, Rosalind. I'd met her exactly twice in my life, both times as a child, both times at funerals, both times introduced with a strange, clipped formality, "Your Aunt Rose, she lives out west now," before she disappeared from every family conversation so completely that I'd genuinely forgotten, until that moment in Denise's kitchen, that she existed at all. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake turning the shape of it over, not fully formed yet, not proof, just a terrible, gathering shape, and somewhere around 3 a.m. I understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, that I might not be the daughter of the family I thought I belonged to at all. I might be the daughter of the aunt nobody talked about, hidden inside the family that raised me by the aunt who ran everything. I didn't tell Ruby. I didn't tell my mother's memory, if that makes any sense. I mean, I didn't allow myself, yet, to reframe 39 years of loving Elaine Calloway around this. I held it, the way I'd always held things, close and quiet and unexamined, and I told myself I needed more before I said a word to anyone else. That was the first time I truly started to understand. I hadn't been raised inside a simple, ordinary family with one small secret. I'd been raised inside a cover-up so old it had become the architecture of the house itself, load-bearing, invisible unless you knew exactly where to press. 3 weeks later, my petition to the state archive came back, approved, faster than expected, likely because closed adoption cases involving a documented deceased or presumed relinquishing parent moved through an expedited channel. What arrived in the mail was thin, 3 photocopied pages, heavily redacted in places, but not everywhere. The birth mother listed, Rosalind Whitmore, age 17 at the time of birth. 17. Not an adult making a private, dignified arrangement, a teenager, a minor, placed in a home for unwed mothers by her own family, in 1986, and the placement of her infant, arranged privately, by, per the case notes, the birth mother's older sibling, acting as guardian in the absence of parental involvement. There was a line further down that stopped my breath entirely, birth mother's whereabouts post-placement, relocated, family arranged, informed child did not survive delivery per family request. Informed child did not survive. Carol hadn't just hidden me from the family. She had told her own 17-year-old sister, a girl who had just given birth, that her baby had died. And then she had arranged for that same baby to be quietly placed with her brother Walter and his new wife, 3 years later, close enough to watch grow up at every Thanksgiving, every gala, every family funeral, while Rosalind believed, somewhere out there, that her daughter didn't exist anymore. I sat at my kitchen table with those 3 pages for a very long time. Ruby found me there when she got home from school, and I don't fully remember what I told her, something vague about a work project, because I couldn't yet find language for what I actually knew. He told me, much later, what was going through her mind that season, though at the time I had no way of knowing any of it. I remember the exact moment I decided. Rose was 17 and pregnant, and our parents wanted her sent away entirely, out of state, the baby placed through an agency with strangers, our name never touched by it. I thought I was protecting her from that. I thought if I handled it myself, quietly, kept the child close, at least someone who loved her would be raising it. I never planned to lie about the baby dying. That was our mother's idea, and God forgive me, I let her make it, because it was easier than watching Rose try to hold on to a child our parents had already decided couldn't exist inside this family. I told myself I'd tell her the truth eventually, when she was older, when it was safer. Every year that passed made the lie heavier and the telling harder, until it simply became the shape of things. I want you to understand I never once, not for a single day, forgot which child was mine to protect and which secret was mine to carry. Then I go back to being the narrator of my own story. I didn't confront Carol yet. I want to be honest about why, some old, deep pattern in me, the same one that had let a folded letter disappear off a kitchen counter years earlier in another chapter of my life, told me to gather everything first, to be certain, to never walk into a room with Carol Whitmore holding anything less than complete proof, because I had watched her, my whole life, dismantle less prepared people with a single raised eyebrow. So instead I did the harder thing. I searched for Rosalind. It took 2 weeks of careful, quiet work, genealogy records, an old alumni database from a high school 3 towns over, a maiden name changed twice through 2 marriages. I found her, finally, living in Asheville, North Carolina, under the name Rosalind Ferris. 61 years old. A retired nurse. No other children listed in any record I could find. I didn't call. I wrote a letter instead, the most carefully worded document of my entire life, 3 drafts before I let myself send it, saying only that I believed I might be connected to her, that I had recently learned some things about a placement in 1986, and that I would understand completely if she didn't want to respond. She called 4 days later. Her voice, when I answered, cracked on the second word. "They told me you died," she said. "I have spent 39 years grieving a daughter they told me never took a breath." I sat on my kitchen floor and cried in a way I hadn't cried since my mother's funeral, and Rosalind cried on the other end of the line. Two women who had never met, tied together by a decision made by a 17-year-old and a 29-year-old in a room neither of us had been present for, and I understood, finally, the full weight of what Carol had built and how long she had let it stand. If you've ever discovered that the people who loved you also lied to someone else who loved you first, you already know there isn't a clean word for that feeling. It isn't only anger. It's grief for a mother you never got to have and a mother you did, both at once, tangled together in a way that doesn't resolve just because you finally know the truth. I had, by that point, everything: the sealed adoption file, Denise's account of Carol's involvement, the state records confirming Rosalind's age and the false information given to her about my death, and now Rosalind herself, alive, willing to speak. I laid it all out on my kitchen table one night after Ruby was asleep, and I understood I was looking at something far larger than a family secret. I was looking at a decision that had shaped every relationship I had, including the one with my own mother, who I now had to consider might have known, might have been complicit, in her own quiet way, in raising another woman's stolen child and never once finding the courage to say so. I came close to calling Elaine's memory a liar that night. I pulled back. Some things, I decided, would only know for certain once I asked Carol directly, and even then, some things about my mother I might never fully know at all, because she wasn't here anymore to answer for herself. I didn't confront Carol that week. I sat with everything I had for 4 more days, deciding how, and when, and whether I was ready for what it would cost. I didn't know it yet, but Carol would move first, and when she did, it would happen in front of the one audience she had spent 40 years protecting most carefully, the whole family, gathered in one room. It was Ruth, my mother's old friend, the one who'd first deflected my question weeks earlier, who unknowingly forced the timeline. She mentioned to Carol, in passing at a church fundraiser, that I'd been asking questions about 1986, and Carol, sensing the ground shifting beneath something she'd spent 4 decades keeping perfectly level, called a family meeting. Not a private conversation. A family meeting, the full gathering, cousins included, at the Whitmore house, the kind of event Carol usually reserved for trust distribution announcements or, once, a decade ago, the sale of the old mill property. I understood immediately what this was. Carol wasn't going to let me confront her on my own terms, in my own time, with my own evidence laid out the way I chose to lay it out. She was going to control the room the way she controlled everything, get ahead of whatever I'd found, and manage me, in front of an audience built to make dissent feel like an ambush. I almost didn't go. I sat in my car outside the Whitmore house for nearly 10 minutes, folder on the passenger seat, hand on the door handle, and some old, tired part of me wanted more than anything to just drive home, to let this stay buried the way it had stayed buried for 39 years, to protect the version of my childhood I still, somewhere, wanted to keep intact. I went in anyway. The living room held 12 people, cousins, a couple of spouses, Denise, who'd been invited as an old family friend, and looked like she wanted to disappear into the upholstery. Carol stood near the fireplace, composed, in complete control of the room's temperature the way she always was. "I understand there's been some digging into old family history," Carol said, before I'd even sat down, her voice pitched for the whole room, gracious and faintly amused, the tone of a woman heading off a rumor before it could take a shape she hadn't chosen. "I think it's important we address this as a family, together, rather than letting misinformation spread." "It's not misinformation," I said. "I have Rosalind's sealed adoption file. I have the state records. I have Denise's account of what you asked her to do in 1986. And I've spoken to Rosalind. Directly. She's alive, Carol. She's been alive this whole time, thinking her daughter died at birth, while that daughter grew up 3 towns over calling you Aunt Carol at every Thanksgiving." The room went very still. I set the folder on the coffee table, not thrown, not dramatic, just placed, the way you place something you no longer need to hold. I said less than anyone in that room expected me to say. I let the papers do the work. Carol's composure didn't crack the way I'd half expected. It sharpened instead. "You have no idea what that year actually looked like," she said. "Our parents wanted Rosalind sent out of state, the baby placed with strangers through an agency, our family name nowhere near any of it. I fought for something better than that. I kept you close, I made sure you grew up loved, in this family, 3 miles from where you were born, instead of disappearing into a system with people who never knew your name. You want to stand in my living room and call that a crime? I want to stand in your living room and ask why Rosalind was told I died." Something moved across Carol's face then, not collapse, not yet, but a fracture, small and real. "That wasn't my decision alone." "Whose decision was it, then?" A long silence. My cousin Meredith, sitting near the window, had gone very pale. My Uncle Rick was staring at his hands. Denise, in the corner, looked like she might be sick. "Our mothers," Carol finally said. "Your great-grandmother. She said it would be easier for Rosalind to move on if she believed there was nothing left to move on from. I let her make that decision because it was easier than fighting her on it, and by the time I understood how much damage it had done, too many years had passed to undo it without destroying everything I'd built to protect you instead." "You didn't build anything to protect me," I said, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very clear, the way water goes still right before it's about to move. "You built something to protect the trust." If Rosalind's pregnancy had gone public, a 17-year-old, unmarried, inside the Whitmore branch, great-grandfather's morality clause would have triggered. You'd have lost control of half the foundation. Keeping me quiet, keeping Rosalind gone, keeping the whole thing sealed, that wasn't love. That was estate management. Nobody in that room spoke for a long moment. I watched something in Carol's face that I'd never seen there before in 39 years, not anger, not composure. Something closer to being, for the first time in her adult life, fully seen. My cousin Meredith stood up. I hadn't expected anything from Meredith. We'd never been close. She'd always seemed entirely absorbed in Carol's orbit, the golden niece who ran the Trust Scholarship program. "I need to say something," she said, and her voice shook. "I found some of this out 2 years ago. Financial records, when I started helping with the Foundation's books. I saw a disbursement from 1986 to Havenwood Home, cross-referenced with legal fees for a sealed adoption. I didn't understand what it meant until right now, sitting in this room. I should have asked you about it 2 years ago, Aunt Carol. I didn't, because I didn't want to know the answer. I'm sorry, Naomi. I should have said something a long time before tonight." That was the moment the room actually shifted, not my evidence, not Carol's fracture, but Meredith, the one person nobody expected, choosing, finally, to stand somewhere other than where she'd always stood. Denise spoke next, quietly, from her corner. "I helped seal that file 39 years ago because I was 19 and scared of losing my job. I've carried that my whole career. I'm not sorry I told Naomi the truth. I'm sorry it took this long." Carol looked around the room, at Meredith, at Denise, at the collected weight of a family finally seeing, all at once, the thing she'd spent 4 decades keeping invisible, and something in her posture changed, the specific defeat of someone who understands, in real time, that the room she built her whole identity inside of no longer belongs entirely to her. She finally spoke again after nearly a full minute of silence, and this time her voice had lost its practiced smoothness. "I was 29, Carol said. I'd just taken over managing the trust from our father, who was already sick, and our mother had never once let me make a real decision in my life without overruling it. When Rose came to me pregnant and terrified, I thought, finally, here's something I get to handle myself. I told myself I was saving her from being sent away entirely, saving you from being raised by strangers who'd never know your name. I told our mother I'd handle the placement quietly. I never agreed to tell Rose you died. That was our mother's decision, made while I was in Boston finalizing legal paperwork, and by the time I got back it was already done, already said to her, and I remember standing in the hallway of that home listening to Rose cry in a way I have never once, in 39 years, been able to forget, and I did not correct it. I told myself correcting it would only reopen a wound that had already, technically, closed. I told myself that every year for 39 years, and every year the lie got a little more load-bearing, until I genuinely believe, God help me, that some part of me started to think of you as mine to protect instead of hers to grieve. That's the truth. I don't expect it to make this better. I've spent 40 years being the person who handles things so no one else has to feel the weight of them, and I am so tired, Naomi, of being the only one who's ever had to carry what handling things actually costs. Nobody moved. I felt something in my own chest crack open in a way I hadn't expected, not forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to it, a recognition that the woman standing in front of me was, underneath 4 decades of control, also someone who had been 29 and frightened and in over her head, once, a very long time ago. I didn't cry in that living room. I looked at her, steadily, with no room left for doubt, and I understood, fully and finally, that whatever version of Aunt Carol I'd believed in for 39 years would never fully exist for me again. I'm not going to pretend this is simple, I said. You lied to a 17-year-old about her own baby dying, and you let that lie stand for 39 years because undoing it would have cost you something. I understand you were young. I understand the pressure you were under. None of that changes what it did to Rosalind, or to me, or to the family that raised me without ever knowing the whole truth of where I came from. What do you want from me? Carol said, and for the first time in my life, it didn't sound like a rhetorical question designed to end a conversation. It sounded like she genuinely didn't know. I want you to call Rosalind. Yourself. And tell her, in your own voice, everything you just told this room. Carol did call her. 2 days later, in my presence, at my kitchen table, a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and that I will never fully repeat, because some grief belongs only to the people who lived it, and I think Rosalind and Carol earned the right to that privacy after 39 years without it. What I can tell you is that Rosalind cried, and Carol cried, the first time, Denise told me later, anyone in that family had ever seen Carol Whitmore cry in adulthood, and by the end of the call, something between the two sisters had shifted that I don't think either of them expected to survive that phone. The consequences that followed weren't dramatic in the way you might expect. Carol didn't lose the trust overnight, didn't get arrested, there was no crime committed, technically, not in a way any prosecutor would touch, 39 years on, no living plaintiff willing to pursue it. But the family's board of trustees, once the story became known, and it did become known, quietly, the way things become known in small towns, through Meredith first, then through people who'd been in that living room, voted, 6 months later, to bring in independent oversight of the foundation for the first time in Carol's tenure. She kept her title. She lost, for the first time in 40 years, sole control. Her name, once spoken with the particular reverence Millbrook Hollow reserves for people it has decided are simply better than everyone else, now carries something more complicated underneath it, respect, still, but no longer unquestioned. Denise and I are still close. Closer, actually, once the guilt she'd carried for 39 years finally had somewhere honest to go. She's the one who helped me, months later, formally amend my birth record, not to erase Elaine and Walter, who raised me and loved me and remain, in every way that matters, my parents, but to add Rosalind's name to the historical file, so that the paper trail, for the first time in 39 years, tells something closer to the whole truth. Rosalind flew up to Vermont that spring. She met Ruby for the first time on my back porch, and I watched my daughter, who has her grandmother's exact laugh, it turns out, a woman she'd never once met, ask Rosalind careful, curious questions about a life none of us had known existed until 6 months earlier. We are, the three of us, still learning the shape of what we are to each other. Not mother and daughter, not exactly, that space belongs to Elaine, still, and always will. Something else. Something we're building slowly, without a script, which is maybe the most honest way any relationship can start. I think about that shoebox in the storage unit sometimes, winter coats, in my mother's careful handwriting, a folder hidden inside it that she never once mentioned to me while she was alive. I don't know, and will never know now, exactly how much Elaine understood about where I came from. I've decided, for my own peace, to believe she loved me exactly as much as she seemed to, regardless of what she knew or didn't. Some truths you have to leave slightly open, because the alternative is spending the rest of your life relitigating a love that was, in every way that reached me, completely real. I don't call Carol often these days. When I do, the conversations are careful, respectful, changed. I've stopped needing her approval the way I spent 39 years needing it without ever quite naming that need. That, more than anything else that happened this year, feels like the actual inheritance. Not the trust, not the money, but the specific, hard-won freedom of no longer organizing my life around a woman who spent 4 decades organizing everyone else's. Looking back, the first red flag was never the shoebox. It was every conversation before it, all the ones where my mother changed the subject a half-second too fast whenever I asked about the year before I was born, and I let the subject change because pressing felt like betrayal. The second flag was Carol herself, at that harvest gala, flinching at a sentence as ordinary as, "I was going through Mom's storage boxes," a flinch I noticed and filed away instead of naming, the way I'd filed away small wrongness my whole life and called it respect for boundaries I'd never actually been told existed. The turning point wasn't finding the shoebox. It was calling Rosalind, the moment I stopped gathering proof to present to someone else and started, for the first time, gathering the truth for myself, regardless of what it would cost the family's careful architecture. The second turning point was Meredith standing up in that living room, unprompted, choosing honesty over the loyalty she'd spent years defaulting to, proof that silence, once one person breaks it, gets harder for everyone else in the room to maintain. The lesson underneath all of it isn't really about Carol, or even about adoption. It's about what happens when a family decides that protecting an institution, a name, a trust, a reputation, matters more than protecting the people that institution was supposedly built to serve. Carol wasn't a monster. She was a 29-year-old handed an impossible decision by a mother who overruled her at every other turn in her life, and she made the choice that felt survivable in the moment, and then she spent 39 years discovering that survivable and right are not the same word. The cruelest detail in this story isn't the sealed file or the false report of a baby's death. It's that Carol Whitmore spent 40 years being genuinely, effectively good at protecting the people around her, and used that exact skill, in 1986, to justify protecting no one but the institution that made her powerful. That's the contradiction at the center of everything. A woman who told herself, and half believed, that keeping Naomi close and keeping Rosalind's grief permanent were both acts of love, when only one of them ever actually served love at all. What the story reveals about silence is that it rarely belongs to just one person. Elaine's silence, Denise's silence, even the family's collective silence around Rosalind's disappearance, none of it was as simple as complicity, and none of it was as innocent as ignorance either. Each person held a fragment small enough to feel forgivable on its own, a records clerk following orders, a mother choosing not to ask questions about a childhood she'd been handed intact, cousins who noticed odd financial entries and decided not to look closer. It took 39 years and one determined woman with an archivist's patience to assemble those fragments into something the whole family finally had to see at once. Naomi's own reckoning matters as much as Carol's exposure. She isn't praised in this story for being fearless, she wasn't. She sat on evidence for weeks at a time, drove away from confrontations she'd rehearsed, let questions go unasked out of the same instinct for self-protection that kept an entire family quiet for 4 decades. Her strength, in the end, wasn't the absence of that instinct. It was choosing, eventually and imperfectly, to act despite it, which is a more honest kind of courage than the fearless version most stories offer. What ultimately separates Naomi from Carol is not virtue so much as timing. Carol was handed her defining decision at 29, alone, under pressure, with no one to model a better choice. Naomi was handed hers at 39. With an archivist's training, a friend willing to finally break her silence, and, crucially, the accumulated example of a family slowly, painfully learning that the truth costs less than the corrosion of hiding it. Neither excuse nor condemn Carol fully. The story asks something harder of its audience, to notice how ordinary, reasonable-sounding decisions, made under pressure by frightened people, can calcify over decades into the very cruelty they were meant to prevent. If there's a question worth sitting with after this story ends, it might be simpler than it sounds. How many families are, right now, protecting an institution, a name, a business, a version of how things are, at a cost none of them have fully added up yet, because no one has been brave enough, or tired enough, or loved someone enough, to open the right folder. What stays with me longest isn't Carol's confession, or even the phone call between 2 sisters separated by 39 years of a lie. It's the detail about the baby photos. The fact that Naomi had spent her whole life not noticing there weren't any of her before 4 months old, because the absence of a thing is so much harder to see than the presence of one. I think that's true of most family secrets. They aren't hidden behind locked doors. They're hidden in the shape of what nobody ever quite says, the story nobody quite finishes, the question that always gets a slightly too quick answer. I don't think Carol is a villain, not entirely, and I don't think that makes what she did any less devastating to the people it happened to. I think she's what happens when someone spends a lifetime being the one who handles things, until handling things becomes indistinguishable, even to them, from controlling them. And I think Naomi's real victory isn't the truth itself, it's that she finally stopped needing everyone else's permission to go looking for it. If any part of this made you think of a question your own family has always answered a little too quickly, I'd love to hear it. Drop one word in the comments, the subject, or the person you're still curious about. Thank you for sitting with this story. Some things are better left buried, Carol said. I don't think that's true. I think some things are just better left unfinished by the people who'd rather not finish them, until someone else finally does.